In our class, we started with a framework. It's known as modernization theory, and we used pattern variables created by Talcott Parsons to sort of characterize societies and countries along a continuum. On one end was pre-modern or traditional, and on the other end was modern. Now, in the previous section video that I made, I encouraged you guys to question this kind of binary typology a little bit. Is it really useful to distinguish between countries that are pre-modern versus modern on the basis of certain cultural characteristics? And today, I'm going to push that a little bit further and talk a little bit about terms like developed versus developing. These are heard frequently, just even in daily conversation if you're talking about global economic issues. And so I want us to think about other typologies that are similar to pre-modern versus modern, and kind of what are some advantages and disadvantages of those typologies, and how can we kind of be more selective about the words we use to describe countries around the world. So I'm going to go through several different kind of terms or groups of terms, several different binaries, dichotomies, typologies, and in each case there will be a map showing which countries are considered which thing, and all those maps have been taken from Wikipedia. So I think most of them are fairly up to date, but in some cases, take with a grain of salt since they're from Wikipedia. So let's start by going back in history a little bit to the Cold War. And out of the Cold War comes our first typology, which is the typology of first world, second world, third world. And so if you've ever heard the term third world country, referring to sort of a less developed country, that comes out of this typology, and this typology comes directly out of the Cold War. So during the Cold War, countries that were allied with the United States and NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, anti-communist alliance, those countries were referred to as the First World. And in this map, they are in blue. So of course, most prominently, the United States and Western Europe were part of the First World. If a country was allied with the Soviet Union and or part of the Warsaw Pact, so the pro-communist alliance, that country is labeled in red on this map. So of course, all of modern Russia, the former USSR, and China are in red here. So that was referred to as the Second World. And then finally, countries that were not aligned with either group were known as the Third World. And interestingly, because the Soviet Union collapsed, in modern usage, we rarely hear people refer to the Second World. We hear First World, for example, if you've heard like hashtag First World Problem. And we hear Third World, like a third world country means a less developed country. But we very rarely hear the term Second World because the Second World kind of doesn't exist anymore. The USSR collapsed, and there's no longer this kind of bipolar system of Western Europe and the US versus the USSR, China, and other communist countries. So this has sort of fallen out of fashion. And this leads me to the advantages and disadvantages of using this typology today. One advantage of using this typology is that it's very clear-cut. So there's very few questions about, well, would this country be first world, second world, or third world? It's a matter of historical record, whether or not the country allied with the US and NATO or with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And so in most cases, I'm sure there are a few ambiguous countries, but in most cases, it's pretty clear-cut which world a country belongs to. So that's the advantage of this typology. The disadvantage, which is obvious and a big disadvantage, is that it's outdated. The Cold War is long gone. The USSR has collapsed to the point that we don't even use the term Second World anymore. And so this typology is just really historically outdated. And I would encourage people to move away from using these terms. So I always try to catch myself if I say third world country, I try to catch myself and rephrase, because there really isn't a first world, second world, and third world anymore. So that's our first typology. Moving forward in history a little bit, we have another typology, which is a dichotomous one, global north and global south. And this is a typology in which some political scientists, sociologists, historians, and even geographers noted that countries in the north tended to be wealthier and more developed, more advanced than countries in the south. And so we have this term global south that emerged. And in particular, Africa and South America are the two continents that are sort of targeted by this typology as being less developed. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this typology? Well, I think the advantage is really only for certain people who are studying certain things. So out of this typology came all these theories about geography and how maybe geography is actually a really key factor that determines how your country develops, or weather. Maybe weather is a key factor in how a country develops. And so the people who are interested in that, so kind of geography sociologists, geosociologists, I'm sure there's a better term, but the people who build these kind of theories enjoy this typology. And I think it has a second advantage, which is that it's very simple. And if you've never stopped to think about why is it that northern countries are wealthier than southern countries, it is definitely an interesting question to ponder. So it kind of reveals a simple truth about the world that can then prompt all kinds of interesting research questions. So that's the advantage. The disadvantage is that it is honestly quite an oversimplification. So, and it's confusing. So if we actually laid the equator on this map, quite a lot of the countries on the map are actually in the north of the equator, including, for example, many of the Asian countries here. North Africa is north of the equator. And so, it's not a clear cut. If you're below the equator, you're part of the global south. So that's, first of all, a bit confusing. And then second of all, as I mentioned, it's an oversimplification. So there are some countries in the southern part of the world that are quite developed. You can see a few blue dots on this map. And I think this may even not have been updated particularly recently, but I certainly see a blue dot here, the Falkland Islands, which I guess these are considered part of the UK, so that's probably why they're colored blue. But the most obvious outlier is Australia. Australia, very clearly situated in the so-called global south, but is considered to be part of the global north because of its high level of development. So that's confusing. And then on top of that, because there's only two categories, it just lumps a huge number of countries together. I mean, personally, I struggle to believe that Argentina is in the same level of development as, Mauritania, for example. And so kind of lumping all these countries together into these very broad categories is a bit, irresponsible, a bit of an oversimplification. So that's the disadvantage of this typology. The next typology we'll talk about is an interesting one. And this goes back to the cleavage that has been talked about in Dr. Markovitz's lectures, which is the center versus periphery cleavage. So often the center is the seat of political power, wealth, authority, whereas the periphery is kind of like neglected, less developed. And that's kind of the story here when we look at the world in these terms. So on this map, the blue countries are considered core or center. So these are kind of the most wealthy countries that have the most trade taking place. Then purple is considered semi-periphery, so sort of an in-between category. And you'll notice that the BRICS are in this category, and I'll talk about that more in a second. And then the red countries are considered periphery, so not a lot of trade going on, not as developed. Let me pause to talk about the BRICS countries. So BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These have been identified originally actually by Jeffrey Sachs of Goldman Sachs. He identified them as countries in which the economies were growing at exponential rates, and they're basically rapidly developing, rapidly industrializing. And so all of the BRICS except Russia, interestingly enough, are highlighted in purple on this map, considered semi-periphery, so sort of an in-between category. Advantages and disadvantages of this typology. So an advantage, maybe the perspective it brings. So this typology looks at the world more in terms of trade and who's doing most of the trading. This typology is also useful for those who subscribe to something called dependency theory, which is the idea that colonies were exploited by colonizers, which resulted in kind of a cycle of dependency where the colonies depended on the colonizer for advanced manufactured goods, while the colonizer depended on the colony for raw materials. And this dependency sort of permanently disadvantaged former colonies. And so if you subscribe to that point of view, this theory makes a lot of sense. You'll notice that most of the former colonies, so most of Africa and a large chunk, most of South America, are considered periphery here. So that goes along, and Asia as well. So that goes along with dependency theory. So that's kind of the advantage, is this perspective about trade and about colonization. I think the disadvantage is that, to me, this theory is confusing. The United States is certainly an outlier as a former colony that's doing amazingly well. The BRICS are all outliers. And I think it's just a little unclear what makes a country, what qualifies to make a country part of the core versus part of the periphery. And then on top of that, it's not obvious just from looking at the map, right? So if I just looked at the map, I might expect the core to be, I don't know, these countries around the Atlantic Ocean, for example. But it's not that. The core is sort of Europe and the United States, and doesn't include these other countries that touch the Atlantic Ocean. And like, what about the Mediterranean Sea? Couldn't that be sort of a core with the rest of the world being periphery? I think just if we look at it spatially, it doesn't quite look like a core and a periphery. So that's another disadvantage of this typology. All right, the last typology I will talk about is kind of the one that is in vogue right now, which is the typology of developed countries, developing countries, and LDCs, or least developed countries. And so this map kind of shows what the UN considers to be countries in each of these categories. The blue are the developed countries, the yellow are developing countries, and then the reddish orange color are the least developed countries. I think this one is in vogue for a reason. It's a little bit more nuanced because it has 3 categories rather than just 2. I will say that the category of developing countries is kind of a big one, and it kind of obscures differences between the degree to which countries are developing. So for example, China is not developing at the same level as Uruguay. China is developing much faster than Uruguay. So the fact that they're both just lumped into the category of developing, that's a disadvantage of this typology. That's a disadvantage of all typologies, is we're putting things into categories, so it's an oversimplification. But I would say this is the one that most people still kind of go to today if they're speaking. It's sort of the most accepted or modern one. However, there are ways we can question it. And in fact, even the United Nations has recently decided that they will try to move away from these categories and instead will simply present raw data. And so we're going to kind of do that now. We're going to actually look into the data a little bit, and that will, allow us to question these typologies a little bit. So what's wrong with all of these typologies? So first world, pre-modern, modern, developed, developing, core periphery. These 4 bullet points kind of show some critiques that apply to all of these typologies. So the first critique is the BRICS countries, which I mentioned before. The BRICS countries have disrupted these categories, especially China. China is considered a developing country for the most part, or considered part of the second world, considered periphery rather than core. And yet China's economy is booming, and China is set to catch up to the US in terms of GDP sometime quite soon. I want to say within the next 10 years, but I could be off on that. And so the BRICS countries, although they are considered developing, they're developing quite quickly, and so they really disrupt these categories. The second issue is that the data is always much more nuanced than 2 or 3 categories can convey. So we're actually going to play with some data to see this. I'm going to start with this. So we're going to the World Bank, their data bank, and we're going to start with GDP. So I'm going to go ahead and put Canada's GDP on the graph. So Canada is a country that, everyone pretty much agrees they are considered a developed country. They're an advanced industrial democracy. They're doing great, right? So here's Canada's GDP on the graph over these years from 1960 to 2019. And then next to Canada, let's go ahead and throw up China. So China is considered a developing country. Supposedly it's not as developed or rich as Canada. And yet, when we compare their GDP on the graph, you see very quickly that China has a much larger GDP than Canada. It's like 7 times larger than Canada right now in 2019. So very interesting that we put China in the developing category and Canada in the developed category in spite of this difference in GDP. I'm going to throw India up there as well. So India, maybe even more than China, we think of it as a developing country, that it still has all these problems, that it's not progressive. And yet when I put India up on the graph, even India is actually displaying here a higher GDP than what Canada currently has. So Canada at 1.7 trillion in 2019 and India at 2.8 trillion in 2019. So even India has surpassed Canada in GDP. So the next thing I want to look at is called the Human Capital Index. The Human Capital Index is a a way that the World Bank tries to measure kind of the potential, the economic potential of human beings in a country. So I think it's something like the average expected salary or skill level of an 18-year-old in a country. And so it's trying to measure like how skilled, how educated the workers in a particular country are. So let's start with the United States. And we would expect, because the United States is considered a developed country, we would expect the US to have a pretty high human capital index. So there's not as much data for this HCI because it's a newer measure, but you can see a few data points here. So in 2017, the US had 0.762 for its HCI. Now, let me throw up Korea. So this is South Korea, Republic of Korea, which is South Korea. And right away we see South Korea actually has a higher HCI than the United States. So we would expect the average skill level and education level of an 18-year-old in South Korea to be higher than that of an 18-year-old in the United States. So that's very interesting because, again, Korea would typically be classified as a developing country, whereas the US is classified as a developed country. And yet here we see a reversal in what we would expect. I'll put up one more country, United Arab Emirates. So the United Arab Emirates has a lower HCI than the United States, but it's catching up. So here in 2018, US has 0.714, UAE has 0.676. And then in 2020, US is at 0.702, UAE is at 0.673. So even countries in the Middle East like the UAE are rapidly catching up to the United States on the HCI, which suggests that the American education system is not training young people is not training young people as well as it could be in terms of the job skills that they possess. So the next critique I want to highlight is that data about the world is generally aggregated by country. So we classify a whole country as developed or developing or an LDC. But that doesn't really give us information about normal people. It also ignores the distinction between urban versus rural. In some countries, the urban environment might be highly developed and prosperous, but the rural environment is very poor. And in some countries, there may be large disparities in wealth. So a few very rich people may sort of capture most of the country's wealth, while the normal everyday people don't live that great a lifestyle. So when you see that a country is listed as a developed country, a question to ask might be, okay, developed for who? And so one way to think about that is using the Gini index. The Gini index is a measure of income inequality. And for the Gini index, you want a low score. So a score of 0 would be a country that had perfect equality. So everyone has the exact same income. And then the higher your score gets, the less equality there is, meaning that a few wealthy people are capturing most of the wealth and the vast majority of people are living in poverty. So this is definitely an important one to think about with the United States. So although the United States has the highest GDP of any country in the world, it has an issue with income inequality. So you notice that in the 1970s and 80s, we have a fairly low Gini score, but then starting in the 80s and 90s, the Gini score rapidly rises to the point that in 2016, it's at 41.1, which is pretty high. And just to run a comparison, let's compare with a developing country. Let's try India. So you can see that India consistently has a lower Gini score than the United States, meaning that incomes are more equal in India. And so although India's overall GDP is, yes, lower than the United States, it's distributed, that wealth is distributed more evenly among the people. I'll put one more country up there. Let's try Egypt. And Egypt here has an even lower Gini index than India. So you can start to see kind of what an outlier the United States is. Again, supposedly a developed country, but developed for who? Many other developing countries have a better score on the Gini index. And then the last kind of critique I want to introduce about typologies like developed, developing, etc., it's just that countries have strengths and weaknesses. So while the US, for example, has a very strong tech industry, it does not have a great healthcare system. And so I think it always pays to look at the data in a more detailed way. Okay, developed, but what aspects of the economy are developed? And I think the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic has been very revealing in this respect for the United States. And I wanted to take the time to actually go through this article from The Guardian by Mona Chalabi and talk about kind of where the US sits in relation to other countries, especially with regard to healthcare, because it is a little bit shocking, to be honest, how little support for healthcare there is in the United States, although it is considered a developed country. And so you can look at this article yourself if you want, but I'm going to show some of the graphs because I just think it's very interesting. So the first graphic that is presented in the article is the number of hospital beds per 1,000 people. And the author has highlighted the so-called developed countries. So for example, North Korea at the top here has 14.3 hospital beds per 1,000 people, followed by Japan with 13.4 hospital beds per 1,000 people. And so you can kind of look at the data in detail if you want. Here's the US with 29 hospital beds per 1,000 people. But I think the important takeaway is to notice that the highlighted countries, the developed countries, are very much mixed in with non-highlighted countries. So these are so-called developing countries. And the idea here is to question a little bit, okay, well, what does developed mean if developing countries have just as many or even more hospital beds per 1,000 people in some cases? So even if we look at the US here, countries like the Bahamas are doing better than the Bahamas, Albania, and Lebanon are all on par with the US with the 29. So just kind of question a little bit, what is developed, what is developing? And here's another visualization of the same concept. And you can see again that the developed economies, which are in purple, are very much mixed in with the developing economies in orange. This graphic shows medical doctors per 1,000 people. And once again, the developed economies are mixed in with developing economies. And here the US is actually at the lower end of the developed economies. This one is a little bit sad, but if you look at maternal deaths per 1,000 live births, we do see a bit more of a dichotomy here between developed economies, which have a very low maternal death rate, versus developing economies, which in some cases have quite a high maternal death rate due to insufficient healthcare, unsanitary conditions, etc. But the sad part is that the United States is really an outlier here. Of the developed countries, the United States has the highest rate of maternal death. And the state I'm originally from, which is Texas, actually has one of the highest maternal death rates of the states in the United States. So this is an issue that is it needs to be looked at more, and people need to be aware of how poorly the US is doing on this measure. Here's life expectancy. So again, you see developed and developing are kind of mixed together here. Income inequality. So this is the Gini score we were looking at before. So again, there's a total mixture of developed economies versus developing economies. And the US is the worst of the developed economies in terms of the Gini index. So very big problem with income inequality in the United States. This one's really interesting and maybe a bit shocking for some people, but if we look at the percent of seats held in government in the lower house of government, so this is a legislature, so in the case of the US, this would be the House of Representatives, because that's the lower house of government. So kind of how many women are in government? Very big mixture between developed and developing. So just because you're a developed economy does not mean you include women more. And the US is kind of the middle bottom of the pack here, of all countries, actually, not even just of the developed countries, but of all the dots here, kind of the US is in the middle of the pack, not at the front of the pack. And the rate is really low. I mean, it looks like something like 21% of the House of Representatives is women, which is quite low when you consider that the proportion in the population is probably about 50% women, 50% men. So I just kind of wanted to show that to, again, push you to question more and more these binary categories that people put countries into. I think it's always helpful to see the actual data and make up your own mind and to ask for greater specificity. What are you talking about when you say developed? What aspect of the economy? Which people? What region of the country? And getting more granular like that is always helpful.